Saturday, April 7th, 1945, a day of desperation for the last few defenders of the Reich. In the skies above Europe, some 1,200 American heavy bombers paraded overhead en route to targets deep inside Hitler's dying Germany. On the flanks of the gigantic bomber stream, 830 P-51 and P-47 fighters stood a vigilant watch against any marauding Luftwaffe fighters. Recently, the American Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots had little to do as they weaved along with the bombers. The Luftwaffe was a shattered force, long since driven from the skies by the combined might of the American and British Air Forces. In fact, only a few German interceptor units still existed as cohesive fighter forces. All over the Reich, signs of collapse were everywhere. Wrecked aircraft littered the Luftwaffe's few remaining airfields, many destroyed on the ground before ever seeing air combat. Others sat in their revetments, their fuel tanks empty as the fuel crisis reached its climax. Few veteran pilots remained. Those pilots still with their Geschwaders were green kids with hardly any flight time. On the rare occasions they got into the air, they were massacred wholesale by the more experienced Allied pilots. On that spring Saturday in April, thousands of Germans were preparing to give up the fight. Some would stay with their units until the war ground to its inevitable end. Others were slipping away to surrender to the British or Americans, whom they knew would treat them far better than the Russians.
Some of the German pilots who fought to the end were pretty bitter as to how some of their comrades ended the war. And a case in point was a squadron commander by the name of Willy Heilmann. He was on a mission with his squadron, and he went off and landed at an airfield known to have been captured by the British. So a month before the war ended, he basically went in and surrendered by himself. The rest of the squadron and the rest of JG-26 fought on for several more weeks, and his name dropped from the official records very precipitously as a result of that. You contrast what happened to Heilmann with what happened to Erich Hartmann, who was the top ace really of all time, and his fighter group. You kind of understand why the Germans could have been a little bitter as to what Heilmann did. Hartmann's group tried to stay together. They actually got their families, and in the final days of the war, tried to get to American lines. Well, through a series of events, they ended up in the hands of a Russian tank regiment. And the Russians surrounded them with their tanks, and then through the course of a night, raped all the family members, raped the children, raped the wives and mothers of the pilots, and forced the German aviators to watch this. And during the night, several of the families later committed suicide because of what was going on, and they realized that this horror was probably going to continue. So one can understand why there was some bitterness towards what Heilmann had done.
Nevertheless, a dedicated corps of pilots remained, taking the fight to the Allies whenever the fuel situation allowed them to climb into their cockpits and get into the air. Their piecemeal, scattered attacks were at best a nuisance to the British and Americans, who by this time could throw over 15,000 aircraft against the Reich's last few hundred defenders. But the Luftwaffe was not going to give up yet. Not when they had one last secret weapon to fling at the stately formations of B-24s and B-17s that brought death and ruin to Germany's cities each day. For amid the ashes, the turmoil, and the chaos of the dying Reich, a new elite unit had been formed for one last-ditch effort to halt the bombing campaign. And on April 7, 1945, It would go into action for the first and only time in its short history. It was known as Sonderkommando Elba. Based around Stendal, the secret unit had one objective: bring down enemy bombers by any means necessary. If gunfire and rockets didn't work, the pilots had been trained to ram the four-engine behemoths. Each man vowed to destroy at least one bomber or die trying.
General Galland was against it. Even Goering was against it. Some of us rammed it out, but accidentally, but not. We were no kamikazes pilots. And our brass was against it.
We didn't hear anything particular that the Air Force had instructed their pilots to fly, not considering the danger to yourself. But you have to bring those bombers down. Unimportant how you do it, but if it has to be, you have to consider being a kamikaze. It sounded incredible initially when you heard about kamikaze being a method for Japanese. Couldn't convey that or apply that to a European human notion. But if you somehow get familiar with that idea to offer yourself as a whole and fly into something which is your object of shooting down, so be it.
The hope was that Sonderkommando Elba would cause so much damage and shock with their suicidal attacks that Americans would suspend their daylight bombing campaign. Shortly before noon, the suicide pilots took flight. From battered airstrips all around Stendal, 120 specifically modified Me-109s and FW-190s formed up into two groups and turned north. For this mission, their planes had been stripped of armor plating, some of their guns, their radio transmitters, and other equipment deemed non-essential. They would go into battle light and fast to avoid the American fighter escort, then plow their interceptors into the bombers. Most of Sonderkommando Elba's pilots had little actual flying experience. All were volunteers, but few had many hours in the air. Fewer still had received navigation instruction. To fix that shortcoming, the pilots were directed to the bomber's stream from the ground by a controller who repeatedly reminded them of the destruction the Americans had wrought on their homes. Operational fighters. It proved to be a motley collection of old and new. Some squadrons entered the fight with war-weary Messerschmitt 109Gs and Focke-Wulf's 190As. Other possessed later variants, the long-nosed FW-190D or the ultra-fast 109K. Still others whistled into battle with the new Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope to turn the tide of the air war in its favor. Over northern Germany, the battle was joined. The jets of JG-7 and KG-54 waded into the bombers, making swift runs through their formation, cannons blazing.
Somebody would announce that there's a jet coming through, and we'd finally get on them, and I couldn't pick them up till they were down lower from the bottom turret, but they would come screaming down through the formation, and I don't know that I could even track them with the turret because they were going so fast. I never shot at one. There were very few ever came close to us.
We saw them going through in a joining group formation, and they came through faster than anything we'd ever seen. What was that?
We've seen Me-262s, but they were fast. They just flew right through the formations, and they were very fast.
As the Me-262 disengaged, the older 190s and 109s tried to reach the bombers. bombers. They were bounced by hundreds of American fighters. Soon, twisting, curling dogfights erupted all over the sky, punctuated by explosions as fuel tanks were hit and demarcated by long trails of smoke as plane after plane plummeted to the soggy ground below. Then the untried youths of Sonderkommando Elbe straggled into the fray. Their inexperienced ranks were savaged by pouncing Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Most never even reached the bombers. Unable to dogfight, they simply didn't know how. They were shot down wholesale. But a few of the Raumjägers reached the bombers. They would do their duty. Down they plunged on the American flying fortresses and liberators, their targets swelling in the windscreens. Defensive fire from the bomber boxes scored many hits, sending several of the German pilots spiraling toward Earth, trapped in their burning cockpits. But the gunners failed to stop the remaining men, who smashed their 109s and 190s into the wings and fuselages of their American targets. 8 times these macabre collisions occurred. 8 times the Liberator or Fortress would be torn in half or would explode into a tremendous fireball. 2 more times bombers were hit but continued to fly, while the Raumjäger went down with his crippled interceptor. By day's end, as the Luftwaffe's few survivors dribbled back to their bases, it was clear that the Germans had at last tasted final defeat. Over 133 planes were lost, along with 75 pilots. Half of Sonderkommando Elbe had been annihilated. 7 of the precious Me-262s were gone. Those who reached home were frequently wounded or burned. Most of the survivors would never fly again. 17 American bombers and 5 fighters were shot down or rammed out of the sky. Far from being the decisive shock that would end the bombing campaign, Sonderkommando Elbe's only mission had been but a spasm in the Luftwaffe's death agony. Only 2 years before this last flight of the Luftwaffe, Germany controlled the skies over almost all of Europe. From the Channel coast to the steppes of Russia, the German fighter pilot ruled supreme. "24 months later, the Reich squadrons lay in crumbled heaps across the length and breadth of the continent, its pilots dead or wounded. This is the story of how this once proud elite corps was so utterly defeated. This is the story of the defenders of the Reich. In 1939, no air force in the world was larger or more modern than Germany's Luftwaffe. Built almost from scratch over the previous 6 years, Germany's Air Force had the best planes, the best equipment, and its pilots were considered the elite of Hitler's armed forces.
The pilots of the Luftwaffe are some of the best of the German armed forces going into World War II. And that's for a variety of reasons. They have a very stringent testing program, they have stringent training standards, and the Luftwaffe has become the premier arm of the German armed forces. And in this way, they have become lionized as kind of the elite of the German armed forces.
Their mission was simple: bring the war to the enemy through terror, tactical support, and Army cooperation. The core of the new Air Force consisted of the dive bomber groups, the dreaded Stukas, and the level bombers, such as the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17. When Germany attacked Poland that September, the Stukas were used to assist the panzer forces on the ground. Through their pinpoint accuracy, the Stuka could sow destruction upon troop concentrations, bunkers, pillboxes, forts, and other tactical targets. While the dive bombers worked closely with the Wehrmacht, the Heinkels and Dorniers would rain bombs down on the rear areas, blowing up bridges, railheads, road intersections, and airfields. When it was deemed necessary, they could be turned against civilian targets and used as terror bombers to bring a population of 39, then again against Rotterdam, Holland in the spring of 1940. Later, London would suffer a similar fate. It was in the Polish campaign and the subsequent invasion of the Low Countries and these early campaigns, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots quickly established air supremacy, allowing the Stukas and Heinkels to wreak havoc without fear of interception. By the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe had conquered all. And yet there were troubling signs within the German Air Force even at this early stage in the war. Conceived and developed with such haste in the 1930s, the Luftwaffe was bound to have institutional problems. Most serious of these was a lack of adequate staff work or strategic planning. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, unpopular World War I fighter pilot who had become one of Hitler's earliest lackeys, commanded the Luftwaffe with a capriciousness that drove his operational level officers to utter helpless frustration.
Göring was a fighter pilot in World War I who was highly decorated. He received the Pour le Mérite for shooting down over 20 enemy aircraft. He ended up with 22. But the interesting thing about his World War I career was that when he took over the Richthofen-Geschwader a few months after Richthofen had died in action, he really proved that he was not anywhere near the kind of leader that Richthofen was. The guys in JG-1 hated him, and in fact, after the war, they didn't invite him to their reunions because they hated him so much. He was a martinet. He only flew a couple of combat missions and then basically grounded himself so he could pay attention to his administrative duties. So he very rarely flew combat with them. So he was kind of a bloated Prussian egomaniac, even back then. And it only got worse. After the beer hall putsch in 23, he was wounded and he became a morphine addict, and that was an addiction he struggled with through most of his life after that. And he became more and more obnoxious and arrogant and covetous of medals and awards and promotions and titles and recognition. And the pilots in the German Air Force actually referred to him as Fat Herman. They did not particularly like him, especially after the events of the Battle of Britain, where he started accusing his fighter pilots of all kinds of misdeeds. They really became hostile towards him. And even today, they talk about Göring, and they're very, very, very hostile. He was a despicable human being.
Hermann Göring, before the war, was tops, as long as there was no war. In the war, what happened when you were a squadron commander, and every evening you reported how many airplanes you have for the next day. Say you had 16 airplanes, but you had only 10 ready for the next day because those were shot up and had to be repaired. You cannot only report 10 airplanes. No. What they did, they changed it, till it came up to the top. They had more planes as we had, twice as many airplanes as we had flying. That was one thing. And Göring was not a leader.
In the 1930s, Göring's vision of the Luftwaffe had been simplistic and dangerously unrealistic. Basically, he wanted airplanes and lots of them. When proponents of long-range strategic bombing tried to convince the Reichsmarschall to order the production of 4-engine bombers that could carry out the task, Göring refused. 4-engine bombers would take up too much material, he argued, so fewer planes would be produced. He wanted numbers, not strategic bombers, and he could have twice as many twin-engine planes as four-engine ones for the same cost. The decision would have serious consequences later when his twin-engine... It was a war of tactical ground support on a grand scale, and in the early weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe cleaned house. Some 15,000 Soviet planes were destroyed, as were thousands of tanks, trucks, airfields, bridges, railheads, and other targets just behind the front lines. Yet operations were costly, and by the end of 1941, the Luftwaffe was stretched ever thinner as it sought to support the Wehrmacht through the dead of winter.
In the period 1941 through early 1943, as the Luftwaffe becomes committed to a global war, they'll find their assets stretched to the limit. And they'll also begin to feel the effects of the attrition that they are beginning to suffer, starting with the Battle of Britain, the meat grinder that the Eastern Front will become, and in actions in the Mediterranean as they're sent down to stop the convoys coming to Malta, fight in the desert, and then try to evacuate the forces from North Africa. They'll suffer some horrendous losses, especially in their bomber and transport crews. And what the effect of these losses is that many of their most experienced pilots, those that would be part of their training base, have been lost. And so the Germans will have a problem with training replacement pilots. By the end of the war, there'll be plenty of planes to fly, but there'll not be any German pilots to fill the cockpits.
Though the skilled German pilots took a heavy toll of Allied ships and planes, their own numbers were whittled down through simple attrition.
On Palm Sunday in 1943, I never forget that, we were escorting 50 Junkers 52, and over there it looked like a swarm of bees waiting for us. We all were shot down. And I made it about 5 kilometers before the beach in Sicily. Then I had to ditch. We lost all the airplanes.
By the summer of 1942, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging on two fronts, and replacements weren't keeping pace with the losses.
We never saw anything in the papers about our planes being shut down. And if there were, the number was always so minimal as we were just winning. There was nothing else but winning.
And then a new and far more deadly threat arrived, one that would ultimately doom the Luftwaffe, the United States Army Air Force. That summer, the Americans undertook their first attempts at daylight strategic bombing. The Halpro mission in North Africa kicked the campaign off with an ineffective raid against Ploesti in June. On July 4th, American-flown bombers struck France for the first time. A month later, the legendary 8th Air Force flew its first mission against Rouen, France. These were hardly even pinpricks against the might of the Third Reich, but they were harbingers of the future. One man saw it coming and urged Hermann Goering to take action. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest fighter pilots and leaders, viewed these first raids with alarm. The Reich's own home air defenses were woefully lacking. Most of the combat units were fighting at the front. And since the British were bombing Germany under the cover of darkness, most of Germany's defenses were geared to stopping nocturnal raids. The Americans were coming over in broad daylight, and that would require new fighters and new tactics to stop. Galland's warnings went unheeded. Goering refused to listen. Fighter production lagged behind demand, and Galland's fellow pilots grew increasingly bitter as they found themselves outnumbered in the air.
By the middle of the war, Hermann Goering, who was, for all his despicableness, was actually a pretty intelligent guy. He realized that the writing was on the wall and that Germany was probably going to lose the war. So, after being discredited so badly by the Luftwaffe's failures at the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad and the Tunis Air Bridge, he kind of retired. He was still nominally the head of the Luftwaffe, but he basically went into seclusion at Karen Hall. And that caused all kinds of problems because he still was the decision maker. And Galland realized that the only way the Luftwaffe was going to survive was if they increased fighter production immediately. They needed fighters, they needed pilots, they needed to stop the Allied air campaign. Göring refused to listen. He continued to order the production of bombers, especially complicated, raw material intensive aircraft. And by the crisis point of the war, early 1944, the Germans and their industrial base really had not kept pace with the way the course of the war had gone. Galland was this lone voice crying in the dark, and nobody listened.
In the summer of 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign began in earnest. To stop the B-17s and B-24s, the Reich would rely on 4 main types of fighters, 2 single-engined and 2 twin-engined. The single-engine fighter groups flew either the Messerschmitt Bf-109G or the Focke-Wulf 190A. Both could be formidable opponents for the Allied fighter pilots, as the Americans first discovered in North Africa.
We were in Benghazi doing escort for 2 cars. We were fighting against Spitfire 5 and Hurricanes and P-40s. The Spitfire was more maneuverable, far more than we were. But only we were better in climbing and we could better climb, out-climb at any time. Then the other thing was we had fuel-injected motors, and they had still carbureted motors. We could do maneuvers which they couldn't do. And P-40s was also a good airplane.
Colonel Fox Raynard, P-40 pilot with the 79th Fighter Group, recalls,
with the P-40 against the 109, the 109 had a higher speed, higher rate of climb, could climb to altitude. We were quite altitude limited with no superchargers. And the one advantage we had over the 109 was that we could outturn them. They could outdive us also, or come close. They were a fine airplane. A lot of performance. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. As far as the 190, it was a far better airplane than the 109. As a matter of fact, we had one of each in the fighter group, in the 79th Fighter Group, and I got to fly both of them. The 190 was a Cadillac compared to the 109. It had a nice cockpit, good visibility, had almost a semi-bubble canopy, and all of the instruments and controls were right where they should be. Everything was it was a natural airplane. Good performance. Probably the airplane of the war until the Mustang came along, the Mustang B.
The Bf-109 and FW-190 were designed to be air superiority weapons. Their main purpose, as envisioned in 1939, was to clear the skies of enemy fighters so the Luftwaffe's bombers could do their work. Neither had been built to intercept enemy bombers. When the American B-17s and B-24s began appearing in Europe's skies, both German fighters showed weaknesses in their new role as interceptors. The 109 was sleek and fast, but dainty and not well armed. The G model usually carried only a single 20mm cannon and 2 7.9mm machine guns. With such limited firepower, Axis 109 pilots found it very difficult to shoot down American heavy bombers, which were extremely rugged. Worse, the 109G was a relatively fragile aircraft, not capable of taking a lot of battle damage.
In attacking bomber formations, the 109 pilots had to run this gauntlet of defensive fire from the 50 caliber machine guns. And especially in the rear attacks, this fire was devastating, and many German pilots lost their lives. The Me-109G proved to be especially frail in these attacks and much inferior to the Me-109F that preceded it. It was less maneuverable. Armament seemed not up to the task of attacking these heavy bombers. There was a heavy frame cockpit which caused it to have poor visibility. Generally speaking, the German fighter pilots considered it to be an inferior fighter. So the Germans will attempt to modify the Me-109G, which is the most produced variant of the Me-109, by slinging 20-millimeter cannons under the wings and pods, and this increase of armament will, in fact, make it much more effective against the bombers, but it will also lower its performance as a fighter. So when American escorting fighters appear over Germany, the Me-109G will essentially become a sitting duck.
Still, the 109 had speed. At 28,540 feet, the Bf-109G-2, with its liquid-cooled 1,475 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine, could just touch 406 miles per hour. It could also race to altitude quickly, an essential asset for any aircraft used as an interceptor. From sea level, it could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 5 minutes. While it could get to the bombers quickly, the 109 could not loiter. It carried enough fuel to stay aloft for only about an hour and a half. That severely limited German attempts to use mass formations against the American bombers, as they frequently took too much time and fuel to assemble. Even with a 66-gallon drop tank, the 109s had only a 250-mile radius of action. Size was another of the 109's assets. With a length of 29 feet and a wingspan of 32 feet, the Messerschmitt had a narrow fuselage and stubby, narrow wings. That made it a difficult target in the air.
And the 109 was a tough adversary. I had one on my tail one time, and I couldn't shake him. I finally did, but they were a good airplane, and almost as good as 51. Not quite. Fortunately, we could outturn them, but contrary to what intelligence told us, we could not outdive them. They informed us we could, but at least the one that was after me, I couldn't outdive. I was going full throttle straight down. But they're very comparable, very good airplane.
Where the 109 was fragile and fussy, the Focke-Wulf was lean and tough. Operational by 1941, the FW-190 quickly proved to be far superior to any Allied fighter of the day. At low altitude, it could outrun anything in the air, including the British Spitfire Mark V. With its phenomenal rate of roll, it could flip over into a split S far quicker than its enemies. Focke-Wulf pilots frequently used the split S to escape from stern attacks as a result. Not until the arrival of the P-51B did the Allies have a fighter equal to the FW-190. Rugged and well-armed, the 190A became the premier fighter in Western Europe throughout the next 2 years.
It was far superior to the 109. Faster, higher, was better climbing, and could go in higher altitude and had more flying time. See, we had only 1 hour flying time. When we, in high altitude, 1 hour and 10 minutes, but it was all. They could fly same as the P-51.
With its 4 20-millimeter cannons and 2 machine guns, it proved to be the only single-engine Luftwaffe fighter that could effectively tackle 4-engine bombers. Its 4 cannon could inflict mortal damage to both the B-17 and the B-24. Later versions of the 190A, which had a wingspan of 34 feet and a length of 29 feet, could carry up to 8 20-millimeter cannon, 4 in the wings, 4 in external gondolas. Such firepower had fearsome effects on Allied bombers. At low altitude, the Focke-Wulf's air-cooled 1,700 horsepower BMW engine could drive the fighter along at about 315 miles per hour. That was fast enough to outrun any Allied fighter of the day on the deck. It reached its optimum max speed at 21,000 feet, where it could sustain 418 miles per hour for short periods. If it had a weakness, it was its high-altitude performance. Above 25,000 feet, the 190 became sluggish at the controls. At any altitude, it couldn't outturn the Spitfire or the P-51, while above 25,000 feet, the P-47 Thunderbolt could turn in sight, as could the P-38L. Turning fights at high altitude usually ended in disaster for the German pilot foolish enough to get into that situation.
If P-47 would outdive anything, you didn't have to worry about shooting anything because you had more firepower than most of them did. And good offense is a good defense. They had a long-nosed 190 that turned out to be pretty good, but there wasn't any of them that really gave us any trouble that I remember. We got a lot of them in the air. We'd go out and get 36 in the air, and some 51 group would go out and get 15 or 20 on the ground. But one time we ran into a bunch of 190s, and I got one, and we got 15 out of 20.
Later on, the 190D became the definitive variant. Dubbed the Long Nose or the Dora, the D model used a liquid-cooled engine and could fly almost as fast as any Allied fighter. The remaining defenders of the Reich in 1943 were the twin-engined heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt 110 and Messerschmitt 410. These aircraft carried awesome arrays of firepower: 20-millimeter, 30-millimeter, even 75-millimeter cannon, heavy machine guns, and even GR-21 rockets.
By mid-1943, the Germans were becoming desperate to figure out ways to break up Allied bomber formations. And so what they did was they took a rocket mortar. Actually, it was basically a mortar shell with a rocket engine attached to it. They called it the GR-21, and they put one in a tube under each wing of their single-engine fighters. And they would go up and they'd take these rockets, and the actual tubes themselves would be angled upwards underneath the wing. Twin-engine fighters, by the way, could carry more than two, but not many more. They would get up, they would fly behind the American B-17 and B-24 boxes, and they'd sit back. They'd have to fire from almost exactly 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters, something like that. There was a precise distance they had to be from behind the bombers. They would fire the rockets. The rockets would go up in this big arc, and if they had fired effectively, they would have dropped right into the combat box and then exploded. And they exploded based on a time fuse. So it was a very, very difficult attack to actually achieve. And trying to lob these mortar shells, basically, with these little rockets attached to them, into American bomber formations proved to be very, very difficult. It was a almost impossible task. But on the occasions where they did actually get the mortar bombs into the formations, they were devastating. They one explosion could take down 2 or 3 bombers. One of the things that the GR-21 did do, though, was it loosened up the bomber formations as the guys tried to get away from these falling rocket bombs.
With the bomber formations spread out, the 110s and 410s would then pounce on the strays, knowing that the defensive firepower the Americans possessed would be more diffused. The heavy fighters made excellent targets, as they were big aircraft and not nearly as maneuverable or quick as the 109s and 190s. As a result, they took severe losses whenever they tried to get in close on tight bomber formations. When American fighters began appearing over Germany, the day of the 110 and 410 came to an end. Neither could stay in the air against the P-47, P-38, or P-51, and they were slaughtered wholesale. Eventually, they were withdrawn and used only as night fighters. When the air war over Germany began in earnest during the summer of 1943, the Americans ran into heavy opposition. As limited as the 109G was as an interceptor, when the B-17s weren't protected by their own escorting fighters, it could inflict heavy losses. Some 109 groups modified their fighters to carry an extra pair of 20mm cannon under the wings, giving them almost as much firepower as the FW-190. The Luftwaffe won the air war in 1943. The interceptor pilots savaged the 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24s. Those first 12 months of the strategic bombing campaign cost the 8th Air Force an average of 33% of its crews and planes per mission. By October, the Luftwaffe had brought the mighty 8th to a crisis point. Either daylight bombing would have to be suspended, or long-range escort fighters had to be developed to destroy the German fighter force. Long-range fighters were brought in, and that turned the tide against the Luftwaffe. First, the P-38 arrived, fast, maneuverable, and able to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Lightning became the first strategic escort fighter in Europe. The Germans dubbed it the fork-tailed devil.
We knew that we were going to be top support for bombers. And at first we were at Nut Hampstead. We called it Mud Hampstead because that's the way it was. We were all new. In fact, that we were so new that when we went on a mission and we finally did turn our guns loose, they only fired one round or so. And we didn't know what the answer to this was, but they had frozen the oil, just plain machine gun oil, was too thick for the machine guns to reload themselves. So naturally, when we got home, we had to ask the bombers, "What do you do?" And they says, "Wash them dry and fire them as long as they will."
Next came the P-51s of the 354th Fighter Group. The 354th arrived in England at the end of November 1943 and began flying combat in December.
When I first went over, not too long after that, we were searching for a name for the group, and we got together as a group and decided on the Pioneer Mustang group because we were the first ones over there.
Able to outmaneuver, outclimb, and outdive every Luftwaffe fighter then deployed, the P-51 proved to be the sword that would slay the Luftwaffe. Soon other units either converted to the P-51 or arrived from the States with the new aircraft. As more and more Mustangs appeared over Germany, the Luftwaffe suffered higher and higher losses. By war's end, 9 of the 8th Air Force's 10 fighter groups were flying Mustangs. The first 6 months of 1944 saw the tide turn permanently against the defenders of the Reich. With the American bombers now supported by swarms of fighters, the Luftwaffe interceptors took to picking off stragglers, bombers who had been hit and had fallen out of formation. Killing the cripples was generally the easiest way to shoot down an American bomber. When not preying on the cripples, the defenders of the Reich had to fall back on fast hit-and-run raids through the weak spots in the American escort screen. They would have time for one pass through the bomber boxes, then they'd dive out of the fight, hoping to live to fly another day. Problem was, there weren't many living to fight another day.
The P-51s, they were escorting P-17s, and that's from a P-17, the tail gunner. Well, I didn't even feel it. I just saw the blood running down, and then I felt it. There was this bullet sticking here. No? I still got it.
During the first 5 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force defending Germany lost almost 100% of its planes and pilots. An average German 190 or 109 pilot by this point in the war lived less than 30 days in combat.
For them it was almost like committing suicide when they were ordered to get up and fly a few missions. Nobody had any enthusiasm anymore to, I think they were all envious of us that we didn't have to do it. But as long as you are in the military, you take orders and you do what you're told. But we noticed if 12 planes went up, there were always 3, 4 that came down again. They found mechanical trouble, so they didn't have to fly.
Men who survived 4 or 5 combat missions were considered the grizzled old veterans. In fact, by the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter units were almost universally composed of green-as-grass pilots fresh out of flight school, led by a small core group of Experten, long-time aces who did their best to teach the newcomers how to survive. But as the war dragged on through the fall of 1944, more and more of Germany's Experten were being killed while attacking the American bomber streams. With its fighter units on their last legs, the Luftwaffe pinned its hopes on a new wonder weapon, the Messerschmitt 262. As the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262 was supposed to revolutionize the air war over Europe and wrest control of the skies away from the Allies one final time. Powered by 2 Junkers Jumo turbojet engines, the Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter then deployed. With its 4 30mm cannon, it could tear apart a bomber with a single short burst. And with a wingspan of 40 feet and a length of 34 feet, it was as small a target as most single-engine fighters.
It was a fighting airplane. It was a good airplane. It was comparably small design. The span was small. The airplane itself was narrow. So it was a size to cope with most of the defense requirements. A small picture of the airplane is harder to shoot at, and especially if that can move fast enough.
Though the Luftwaffe hoped the 262 would be its savior, the new jet fighter had too many problems to be an effective answer to the Allied bombing campaign. Plagued with material shortages, production of the 262 was delayed several months so that it did not see much action until the fall of 1944.
The first one I flew in September 44. You had a guy sitting on the wing and then the cockpit open and he explained to you what this all is, and then explained what the speed is to take off and what the approach speed is, and say, now go. But he never had to see this.
The Messerschmitt 262 was truly a revolutionary aircraft, but like all revolutionary aircraft, it had some major problems with it. And these were problems that really could not be ironed out given the conditions that Germany found itself in the final stages of World War II. Most importantly, they were running out of raw materials that would go into making the engines. So they were forced to substitute different metals into the engines, which led to turbofan blades breaking and other things like that. The engines were really the weak point in the 262. If you jammed the throttles forward too quickly, they would catch fire. If you abused the engines in any way, they would catch fire. And in the fighter groups, they lasted only a few missions before they had to be replaced. There were lots and lots of little bugs, technical problems that afflicted the Messerschmitt 262 program from the beginning and were never ironed out, which is one of the reasons why you never see Messerschmitt 262s flying around now, because they're so dangerous to fly. You know, you see 51s flying around, you see Messerschmitt 109s flying. Nobody flies 262s. They're dangerous aircraft. Another major issue was the fact that there weren't any trained pilots to fly the Messerschmitt 262 in training commands. So the pilots that were going into units like Commando Novotny or JG-7, they didn't know how to fly these aircraft. They were revolutionary. They had never experienced anything like it. So it took time to train them, and there wasn't time. There wasn't time, and they didn't receive the training. And so overall, the Messerschmitt 262 was a failure operationally. They lost probably at least as many Messerschmitt 262s in the operational units as they shot down enemy aircraft.
There were tremendous losses involved in the pilot training, and the pilots themselves, the pilots were poorly brought up to facing a war environment. They were not using the airplane to the advantage it had offered initially.
The engines were so fragile that pilots thought they had to advance the throttles very slowly or run the risk of fire or mechanical failure. Consequently, if American fighters caught an Me-262 and it wasn't traveling at top speed, they had the advantage. In those situations, the new jet proved to be easy prey for Allied fighters. Other Me-262s were shot out of the sky by canny P-47 and P-51 pilots whose snapshot accuracy paid dividends.
He started climbing, and so died it, and I just started firing all the way through, and I kind of was firing all the way through when I was going up. And he went by me, and then I kind of fell out into an Emmelman because I'd lost a lot of speed. But I made an Emmelman up there. Then I rolled over like that to see the plane, and I laid down on it, went down again, and took some pictures of it. And so the guy said, well, the guy that got him spun out. I said, no, he didn't. I said, a pretty sloppy Emmelman. I said, I didn't spin out. And then Comstock said, is that you, hotshot? I said, yeah, good for you. So we came home, we were pretty happy. That was the first group. And then they gave a half to another pilot. And I never saw his film, and I don't know how he hit the plane or whether he hit it or not. But I knocked the plane down.
By December, though the Germans were desperately deploying the Me-262, the Luftwaffe had been all but defeated. Desperate for pilots, General of the Fighters, Adolf Galland, began culling men from bomber and transport units to fill the cockpits of an ever-declining number of operational 109s and 190s. Fred Boost, an Me-323 Gigant pilot, was one such aviator caught up in the dragnet.
The transport wings, most of the bomber wings were disbanded. The pilots were sent to Berlin and were asked whether we would become fighter pilots. You couldn't say no. If you said no, you were transferred to the SS armor tank battalions, and that was the last I ever wanted to be. Here came Galland and said, all right, these are the first or the former transport flyers. Now, who of you hotshots does not want to become a fighter pilot? Who does not want to become a fighter pilot? Nobody raised his hand. He said, all right, you'll be fighter wing number 104 in Vienna. I said, sure.
Such men did not last long. With American planes scouring the daylight skies from Aachen to Warsaw and Prague, the Luftwaffe had no safe airspace in which to operate and train its new pilots. Fred Boost's experience was not atypical. In the few months he survived as an FW-190 pilot, American fighters shot him down twice. The last time occurred over his own airfield while he was landing.
We were supposed to protect Berlin, which was very easy to find. You had to look where there was a big smoke. That was Berlin. We were coming in. The P-51s were just circling around Wesendorf and just waited for us to land. And just as my turn came, okay, you are next, one of them picked me out, and I again was already not higher than maybe 30 feet. And just upon landing, he got me from behind and didn't wound me, but shot the plane not to pieces, but the undercarriage didn't get out and couldn't control it anymore. He must have hit not the cockpit, but the area around me, and I pancaked very hard.
And yet the Luftwaffe would not give up. On January 1st, 1945, Goering ordered a maximum effort strike against Allied airfields in France and Belgium. Dubbed Operation Bodenplatte, this last ground attack effort was designed to support the failing German offensive in the Ardennes. Over 1,000 single-engine fighters were flung at the British and American bases on the continent that day.
That morning, they surprised us. So much buzzing going on, so many engines running and so much noise at the airfield. And every plane that could fly had to get up. I think something like 2/3 came back and the others never made it back. And from what the pilots told us, they usually, I think mostly in France, they attacked planes on the ground by surprise, and I think were somehow successful and destroyed Allied planes on the ground.
In some places, they achieved complete surprise. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, but few pilots or aircrew were killed. In return, the Luftwaffe lost almost 300 planes and 214 pilots, including 19 squadron and group commanders. It was a disaster that finally broke the back of the German fighter force.
After that, you hardly saw one going up. They had the plane still at this little airport, but they probably knew that it was useless to even try to get up, because if 2-3 went up, they were being intercepted by about 25 or 30 or whatever, And at that point, the Messerschmitt was just no match anymore against something like the P-51.
By the end of the war, faced with what has essentially become a lost cause, it's only the individual devotion of these pilots of the Luftwaffe, devotion to their homeland, their devotion to their duty as a soldier, that keeps them flying for this lost cause.
And yet the end would soon come. That spring, all across Germany, American, British, and Russian tank columns rumbled through the countryside, capturing cities, factories, and air bases as they went. For those few remaining defenders of the Reich, gas deliveries dried up. Ammunition became scarce, and replacement aircraft became only distant memories. The men waited for the end at their air bases, or in some cases took to the roads together in hopes of surrendering to American or British troops. Some of the most famous fighter groups were captured wholesale by the Russians, who showed no mercy.
We heard, rumors among boys about the treatment of the Russians, how their prisoners of war were treated by Germans and how German prisoners of war were treated in Russia. And that was always a nightmare, that you were shot down over Russian territory.
Some of Germany's greatest aces disappeared into Soviet labor camps and were not seen again until the mid-1950s. For Fred Boost, the end came near the Danish border in the waning days of the war.
I'm sitting strapped in my plane, everything ready, and I am tired. It's about 8 o'clock at night, and it's May. It's still daylight, and I begin to doze off. And as I sit there, somebody very hard rattled the rudder. So my legs went. I cranked down the canopy and said, "Leave an old man alone." And I looked up and looked into a guy with a helmet, a scans, and a Sten gun in his hand. "Come on out, Jerry. Come on out, Jerry." I said, "Sure, yeah, I am coming out." So I cranked it all the way down, got out, and I reached back, and he said, "Ah, ah, ah, ah," because we had our sidearms on the right hip. "Hands up." And I had no intention to shoot. I got out, slid down the wing, stood there, and the other guys in the planes, but they ran. "Would you please assemble," very politely, "would you please assemble in the flight control room?" So we walked up there. I took off my parachute and threw it back into the plane. And as we were standing around there, this British lieutenant, he said, "Gentlemen, we are a British special commando. We are racing to go to Copenhagen. That's where you come in. We want to be in Copenhagen before the Russians, because we have intelligence that the Russians want to occupy Denmark, and you Germans definitely have an interest that they shall not occupy Denmark. So don't do anything foolish. Don't hinder us. We will fight you with all we have, if need be, but don't do it. In your best interest, leave us alone. We leave you alone. Any questions?" Anybody had a question? "Thank you. Don't do anything foolish." And they got out, and they had those 8-wheel, I think they are American-made, armored personnel carriers, and they zoomed off, and all night we heard the armor, not just trucks, but armor go by, and they raced and occupied Denmark. And we said, "All right, we are now behind the front. What do we do?" And I never forget, as one guy said, "What do? We drink." And somebody got some beer, and we had a long, long session together, BSing and drinking beer.
With the war's end, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Though they fought bravely, even suicidally, the defenders of the Reich had failed to save their nation from total destruction. Though once thousands strong, only a few of Germany's great aircraft survived in the post-war world. Thousands lay alongside runways, nothing but twisted wreckage gathering weeds as they slowly rusted away. By 1950, the Luftwaffe's fighter force existed only in old photos and in the memories of those men who, despite telling odds, rose to do battle time and again in a cause as hopeless as it was perverted. They were the defenders of the Reich.